All right, today we're taking a deep dive into the truly fascinating and, yeah, sometimes pretty frightening world of 16th century medicine. This was a time that was really caught between these ancient, centuries-old traditions and the very first sparks of what we'd call modern science. Getting sick back then? It was a whole different ballgame.
I want you to just imagine this for a second. You wake up, you've got a fever. There's a strange rash on your skin. Today, your mind immediately goes to things like viruses, infections, your immune system, right? But back in the 1500s, none of those ideas even existed. So what on earth did they think was happening to you?
Well, your entire understanding of sickness would be on a completely different planet. Forget about germs, you'd be worried that your body's 4 essential humors were out of balance. Instead of getting antibiotics, the top recommendation might be bloodletting. And you wouldn't blame contagion, you might look to the stars or believe it was an act of God. It's a total paradigm shift.
To really get our heads around this, we need to look at the ancient framework that shaped pretty much every single medical decision for over 1,000 years, an idea that came straight from the ancient Greeks and Romans.
This right here was the core idea, the absolute bedrock of medicine. Your body had 4 main fluids, or humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If you were healthy, it just meant those 4 fluids were in perfect, harmonious balance. Sickness was nothing more than a sign that one of them was out of whack.
And what's wild is that this system had its own complete internal logic. It wasn't just random guesswork. Let's say you had a fever. Well, that meant you were too hot and moist, a surefire sign you had too much blood. So what's the logical cure? Get rid of the extra blood through bloodletting. See? Every single ailment was tied to a specific imbalance, and every imbalance had a specific remedy designed to bring you back to equilibrium.
Okay, so even while this ancient theory of humors was the undisputed king, something new was brewing during the Renaissance. People were starting to think about knowledge itself in a completely new way. Scholars and physicians, for the first time in a long time, started to question the absolute authority of the ancient masters, guys like the Roman physician Galen. Instead of just taking what was written in these old books as gospel, they started to value what they could actually see with their own 2 eyes. And this led to a new focus on hands-on experience and, most importantly, on human dissection.
This is where people like Andreas Vesalius become absolute game changers. By doing his own dissections, he found that the ancient texts were filled with errors, things that had been accepted as truth for centuries. Now, this didn't immediately create new cures, but it proved something huge, that direct observation could actually overturn ancient tradition. That was a critical first step for all of modern medicine.
And then you had total radicals like Paracelsus. He came along with this absolutely wild idea for his time. He said, hey, what if sickness isn't from some imbalance inside us, but from agents outside our bodies? Things like poisons or minerals. He was basically sketching out a version of germ theory centuries before anyone would prove it right.
But here's the thing. These brand new scientific ideas didn't just pop up in a vacuum. Nope, they had to exist side by side with a much older, and for most people, a much more powerful framework: faith. For your average person in the 1500s, getting sick wasn't just a physical problem. It was deeply spiritual. An illness might be seen as a punishment from God, or maybe a test of your moral character. Or maybe it was just a cosmic event, all because the planets were aligned in a certain way. Health was this totally holistic concept that blended your body, your soul, and the entire cosmos together.
And what that meant was that a typical treatment plan would just seamlessly merge all these different worlds. It was never science or faith, it was always both. A doctor might look at an astrological chart to pick the perfect day for a bloodletting, while an apothecary mixed up an herbal remedy, and the local priest would advise a pilgrimage to a holy shrine. It was all considered part of the same healing process.
So who are the people actually providing all this care? Well, it wasn't one single profession like we think of today. It was this complex, really rigid hierarchy, and the kind of treatment you got depended almost entirely on your social status. At the very top of the ladder, you had your university-educated physicians. They read Latin, they diagnosed the rich, but they rarely, if ever, got their hands dirty. Below them, you had the surgeons and the barber surgeons. These were the guys who did the practical work, the bloodletting, setting broken bones. Apothecaries were kind of like today's pharmacists, mixing herbal medicines. And for most everyday people, care came from midwives and local folk healers who relied on generations of practical local knowledge.
Now, this entire system of belief, the humors, the astrology, the social ladder of healers, was about to collide head-on with a challenge that it was completely unprepared for:
all thanks to the age of exploration. When European ships started crossing the Atlantic, they weren't just carrying people and supplies. They were carrying diseases. Smallpox, for example, was a terrifying but familiar illness in Europe. A lot of people had some immunity because they'd survived it as kids. But in the Americas, it was something nobody had ever seen before.
And this is where you get this absolutely catastrophic collision of biology. In Europe, smallpox was a known enemy. In the Americas, however, the indigenous peoples had zero prior exposure, and that meant they had zero immunity. A disease that was often survivable in Europe became an unstoppable tidal wave of devastation for entire civilizations.
The numbers are they're almost impossible to truly comprehend. In some communities, the mortality rates from these new diseases hit as high as 90%. Let that sink in. Entire societies were just wiped out.
Without germ theory, without any concept of immunity, the Europeans had to try and make sense of this unbelievable tragedy using the only tools they had. And so their framework of divine will and cosmic science led many to interpret the catastrophe not as a biological event, but as a sign of God's favor for them, or even as a justification for their conquest.
So, what's the big lesson here? After this whole journey into 16th century medicine, why does understanding this old way of thinking matter so much to us today?
Well, the big takeaway is that their medicine wasn't just wrong. It was a complete logical system built on the knowledge they had at the time. And this system of belief didn't just affect individual patients. It was used to interpret and justify world-shattering events. The story of smallpox in the Americas proves a really powerful truth: how a society explains disease can have consequences that literally shape the course of human history. And that leaves us with one final, pretty provocative thought. They were acting based on what they knew to be true: humors, astrology, divine will. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? Which of our own modern scientific certainties will look just as strange, just as foreign, to people 500 years from now?